Anti-Semitic Anti-Zionism, Muslim Brotherhood, Iran, and Hezbollah, by Stephan Grigat. As a preacher on Al Jazeera and head of the European Council for Fatwa and Research, Youssef al-Qaradawi is one of Sunni Islam's most influential intellectuals. Al-Qaradawi has gone beyond denying the Holocaust to presenting the Holocaust as an example to be followed. According to him, Hitler was the, quote, ultimate punishment, end quote, for the Jews, inflicted on them by Allah for their depravity. In the future, he believes the Muslims must take on the task. In 2009, he stated, quote, God willing, the next time this punishment will be inflicted by the hand of the faithful, end quote. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, in which al-Qaradawi has his roots, shaped all the later currents of radical Islam, including the Iranian regime and Hezbollah. While these latter are, of course, in some respects in competition with Brotherhood groups and parties, they can also cooperate with them, especially when it comes to fighting Israel and with respect to a shared hostility to the rulers of Saudi Arabia, considered by some supporters of the Iranian regime to be descendants of Jews. The prototypical Islamist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood, was founded in 1928, in the same period as the rise of the fascist mass organizations in Europe. It also drew inspiration from the writings of the Iranian Islamists of the 19th century. The Nazis actively supported the establishment of the Brotherhood materially and ideologically. After 1945, it became the, quote, biggest anti-Semitic organization in the world, end quote, with around 1 million members. The rapid rise in its membership at the beginning of the 1930s, like the support for European fascism and Nazism, but in a different religious context, resulted from a massive and delusional projective reaction to the crisis-ridden onslaught of capitalist modernity. This reaction against the ambivalences and emancipatory potential of modernity was also one of the main grounds for the mass support of Khomeini from the 1960s onwards in Iran. While the political program of the Muslim Brotherhood was legitimated by reference to the religious text of Islam, resulting in clear differences from fascism and Nazism in spheres such as sexual morality and gender politics, it closely resembled and still closely resembles the radical right in Europe in crucial politico-economic respects. Rejection of parliamentarianism and multi-party democracy, the struggle against liberalism and Marxism, demonization of interest, and proclamation of a community of interest between capital and labor, which has to be defended against the allegedly destructive forces of an abstraction identified as Jewish. In their advocacy of sacrifice, their death cult, and their anti-Semitism, texts such as Industry of Death, issued by the Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna, in 1938, or Sayyid Qutb's 1950 track, Our Struggle with the Jews, recalled Nazism despite their Islamic orientation. And these were and are not the pamphlets of isolated cranks, but have been and are still being disseminated in millions of copies in some Islamic countries. Before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Sayyid Qutb's writings were translated into Farsi by Iran's current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, and continue to form one of the central ideological reference points of the Iranian Islamists. Just like the Nazis, even if less successfully, the Sunni jihadists and Iranian Islamists are concerned not only with the enlistment of a people for the purposes of exploitation and domination, but with the formation of a society of martyrs in which individuals sacrifice themselves for the Ummah, the community of all Muslims. despite all the real and significant differences in historic context, legitimating references, economic and political structures, and military capability. The hate objects of the Islamic jihadists resemble those of Nazism, communism and materialism, liberalism and Western, quote, plutocracy, end quote, individualism, emancipation, and Zionism. After 1946, Hassan al-Banna showered praise on Amin el-Husseini, the rabidly anti-Semitic Mufti of Jerusalem, who had collaborated with the Nazis and resided in Berlin after 1941. He managed to evade prosecution by the Allies after the Second World War by fleeing to Cairo, where in 1946 al-Banna today still is a revered figure. Fleeing to Cairo, where in 1946 al-Banna, today still a revered figure, declared of him, quote, "What a hero, what a miracle of a man, who defined an empire with the help of Hitler and Germany and fought against Zionism. Germany and Hitler are no more, but Amin al-Husseini will pursue the struggle," end quote. Recently, the German-Egyptian writer Hamed Abdel Samad has brought the term, quote, Islamic fascism, end quote, back into the discussion, emphasizing the links between Islamism in general and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular with fascism and Nazism, albeit on the basis of a dubious religious exegesis rather than on ideological critical understanding of anti-Semitism, in which modern Islamic Jew hatred is decoded as a projective repudiation of a new, ambivalent, and potentially emancipatory form of society, as a form of modern anti-modernism. Moreover, the specific quality of the Islamic anti-Semitism characteristic of the Brotherhood and Iranian regime needs to be emphasized since, quote, only here do we find the degrading anti-Judaism of early Islam fused with modern conspiracy theorizing anti-Semitism, end quote. Kunzel. And I don't know what Kunzel's politics are now, but Kunzel, I believe, was one of the I think he came out of a anti-German K group, but I'm not sure. Anyway, today, use of the term Islamic fascism excites knee-jerk reactions, particularly in parts of the left. However, it is virtually unavoidable when it comes to dealing with authoritarian anti-Semitic mass movements with a leader cult and a martyrdom ideology that wage permanent campaigns against groups deemed threatening to the unity of the Ummah, use unrestrained brute force against political opponents, and advocate a, quote, third way, end quote, between capitalism and socialism, east and west. A more serious question is whether the fixation on the term fascism does not tend to underplay the anti-Semitic dimension, since the centrality of anti-Semitism in all variants of the Islamist discourse make it far closer to Nazism, despite all the differences in other spheres, than to classical fascism of the Italian variety. This centrality is especially clear in the case of the Islamist ideology of the regime that has ruled Iran since 1979 and its allies such as Hezbollah, which today present one of the main threats to Israel. The government of the gangs and anti-Semitism. Three main points need to be addressed in relation to the Iranian regime's anti-Semitism. Firstly, the traditional Jew hatred that is especially apparent in, but not confined to its founder, Khomeini, who is still revered by the regime's supporters. Secondly, the denial and relativization of the Holocaust. Thirdly, the explicit threats to destroy Israel and the regional policies that result from it. While all these aspects are present at all stages of the history of the Islamic Republic, at certain times particular ones have come to the forefront. Explicit Jew hatred is especially marked in Khomeini's pre-revolutionary writings, but even after 1979 it continually breaks through and today determines, alongside traditional Islamic laws, discriminatory practices against Iran's Jewish minority. Verbal attacks on Israel and the support for anti-Israel terrorist groups have been a constant feature of the Iranian regime's ideology and practice, and have been voiced and translated into action since 1979 by all factions of the regime. Hatred of the Jewish state is one of the core elements of the Islamist ideology, and is by no means only a, quote, means to an end, end quote. Schweitzer. The heyday of Holocaust denial came during the presidency of Ahmadinejad, who placed it at the center of his policy and rhetoric, but both his predecessors, Ali Akbar Hashemi, Rafsanjani, and Mohammad Khatami, were also Holocaust deniers, as is the current supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Since 2013, the current president and his foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, have toned down the Holocaust denial somewhat, but even under Hassan Rouhani, Iranian official bodies have been involved in Holocaust denial events. The relativization of Nazi crimes has been promoted by the Rouhani administration itself, an example being Zarif's statement that, quote, "We condemn the Nazis' massacre of the Jews, and we also condemn the massacres of Palestinians committed by the Zionists," end quote. Here he not only downgrades the Shoah to a massacre, but also declares the Israelis to be the Nazis of today. Many international observers chose to interpret this statement as a clear break with Holocaust denial. In fact, it represents a modernization of anti-Semitism by adapting it to international anti-Israel custom and practice. Finally, it must be remembered that the official line on such matters is set not by the president or foreign minister, but by the clerical supreme leader, whose powers include the right of appointment to over 100 leading positions in the political, judicial, administrative, military, media, and religious institutions. Holocaust denial is the official position of Supreme Leaders Ali Khamenei, and no Iranian official can do anything against it, end quote. M. Mohadi. Iranian Holocaust cartoon competitions and exhibitions, goals, sponsors, and themes. The Iranian regime was quick to condemn the clearly anti-Semitic attack by a competing Islamist faction on 9/11, despite the instances of technical cooperation with al-Qaeda. This reinforced the already evident tendency of the Western media and experts to downplay and relativize the anti-Semitic and state terrorist character of the Iranian regime. Then a few days later, during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad after 2005, the strident rhetoric of his former revolutionary guards Jesus Christ. Then a few years later, during the presidency of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad after 2005, the strident rhetoric of this former Revolutionary Guards officer brought the regime's Holocaust denial and threats to annihilate Israel to the attention of a wider global public. However, both before, during, and after that presidency, the Iranian regime of Ayatollahs and Revolutionary Guards has throughout remained a religiously legitimated dictatorship characterized by an interplay of state and, quote, revolutionary, end quote, institutions with an ideology that is both anti-Semitic and anti-Western and state terrorist and martyrdom oriented. What distinguishes the Iranian regime from other despotisms conditioned by Islam makes it especially dangerous is the combination of a revolutionary activist Islamism centered on belief in the Mahdi, the state-driven effort to obtain the technology for weapons of mass destruction, and a radical anti-Zionism shared by all currents within the regime. The Mahdi is the hidden 12th Shiite Imam, who, it is believed, will one day return. Under the Iranian constitution, it is he, the Mahdi, rather than the supreme leader, who is the head of this state in Iran. Vilayat-e-Faqih, the quote, guardianship of the Islamic jurist, end quote, is intended through puritanical terror within and the export of the Islamic revolution abroad to pave the way for his return. The regime that has ruled Iran since 1979 openly proclaims its religious ideological goal of world rule. Proving the existence of this claim does not require sophisticated critical techniques. A brief look at the explicit content of the writings of the regime's founder, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, is quite enough. Moreover, Ali Khamenei, who has described Israel as a, quote, cancerous tumor that should be cut and will be cut, end quote, has also made clear statements in this respect. The anti-Semitic and conspiracy theorizing worldview and the threats of the destruction against Israel, shared by all factions of the regime, play a decisive and indeed necessary role in integrating the hostile gangs of the Iranian regime, and the factional fight is not only over who is to get the biggest share of the pie, but also over who can best advance the program of eliminatory anti-Zionism. In the original and for a long time operational conception of the Islamic Republic, the supreme leaders ruled over the factions and mediated between them. The, quote, Prince of the Believers, end quote, as one of the many titles held by the leader describes him, embodies the awareness that, as Khomeini once put it, the regime needs two wings in order to achieve its goals, and would be in danger of falling if one of them were simply to be cut off. This conception was called into question by Khamenei's clear and early support for Ahmadinejad during the 2009 electoral farce. Since Rouhani's election in 2013, it has once again become operational. One expression of this restoration has been the composition of Rouhani's first government. In choosing his ministers, Rouhani took into account the wishes of almost all the factions to create a kind of grand coalition, in order to broaden the base of the regime and to strengthen it for the prospective annihilation effort. Admittedly, supporters of Ahmadinejad and his long-standing spiritual mentor and political promoter, Ayatollah Mesbah Yazdi, who has declared that, quote, the Jews are the most corrupt in the world, the most seditious group among all human beings, and they will not leave Muslims alone until they destroy Islam, end quote, were not represented in Rouhani's first cabinet. However, the fact that Khamenei had appointed Ahmadinejad a member of the influential Expediency Council shows that even this faction, which stands for an especially radical interpretation of the Mahdi doctrine, continues to play a role. This still holds true after Ahmadinejad was disqualified from the presidential race in 2017 by the Guardian Council. In October 2019, during the second term of President Rouhani, Iranian cleric Ibad Mohammed Tabar declared, quote, God willing, when the hidden imam arrives, all us Muslims will, under his leadership, confront the biggest enemy of Islam, the Jews. According to a Quranic verse, the Jews are the greatest enemy of Islam. End quote. The struggle for official positions and influence between the spiritual, political, and military leaderships, the Revolutionary Guards, secret services, and economic elites, and the Larijani brothers, the Khamenei circle, and the Rafsanjani clan has calmed down a bit under Rouhani. Since 2013, the various factions must pay somewhat more heed to the overall interests of the regime. However, the interest groups have not disappeared, and further, such conflicts are inevitable, particularly in relation to efforts to contain the power of the Revolutionary Guards. Khamenei himself was clearly determined to rein in the Pastoran's power somewhat, following speculation about Ahmadinejad's term of office. Following speculation during Ahmadinejad's term of office about whether the Guards, who had been extending their control over ever-widening spheres of economic and political life, really needed the clergy anymore, and whether the theocracy might turn into an open military dictatorship. As a result, there were only 3 Pastoran ministers in Rouhani's first government, whereas over half of the members of Ahmadinejad's first cabinet were recruited from either the Revolutionary Guards or Basiji. However, this shift has nothing to do with some kind of wind of moderation. It represents merely a shift between power centers, in this case toward the traditional security apparatus, which is in competition with the Pastoran, and in particular in favor of the VEVAK security service, which was more strongly represented in Rouhani's first government than in any since 1979. The Iranian regime's aggressive foreign policy, which is characterized simultaneously by pragmatism and a mania for annihilation, corresponds domestically with a social form of organization that is characterized by the rule of competing gangs or, quote, rackets, end quote. Drawing on Max Horkheimer's theory of a racket and Franz Neumann's study Behemoth, Gerhard Scheidt, who I believe wrote Gerhard Scheidt wrote the rackets entry in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, edited by Werner, Bonefeld, Chris O'Kane, and Beverly Best, I believe her name is. Okay, so that's who Gerhard Scheidt is. Analyzed the Islamic Republic as a, quote, non-state, end quote. According to his analysis, the Islamist Revolution of 1979 represents, quote, the opposite of the bourgeois revolution which triumphed in France. Both revolutions lifted the state's monopoly on the use of force and replaced it with the power of terrorist groups. However, in one case, the terror results in the rule of law that is guaranteed for the sake of capital's realization by a new monopoly on violence, and in the other case, terror continues undiminished in the different forms of Sharia, and sees itself shielded by the name of Allah and oil revenues. End quote. Since Khomeini's accession, the Iranian regime has been characterized by a rivalry of rackets hostile to each other, while the supreme religious leader reigns above all. In this way, the whole Iranian constitution cannot be understood as a form of bourgeois law. Quote, the complex structure of the constitution is merely there to provide room for the disparate activities of these rackets, who declaredly prefer the state of emergency, end quote. Since 1979, parallel to the state's organs, additional institutions have been formed in Iran. The influence of the regular courts of justice is restricted through the existence of numerous special courts. Beyond these military tribunals that are common in other countries, there exist so-called, quote, revolutionary courts, end quote. The, quote, court for the justice of bureaucracy, end quote. The, quote, special court for the clergy, end quote. end quote, press courts, end quote. Besides the National Army, the Pasdaran has been established as an alternative revolutionary military force, which today is one of the most influential and probably the most dangerous rackets within the regime's power structure. The Revolutionary Guards not only represent the regime's military elite, but also one of the most important economic conglomerates in Iran, which provides its members with economic and social gains. For several years now, the Pasdaran have used their military power to gain control of crucial branches of Iran's economy, particularly in the realm of foreign trade. Similar to German National Socialism, but in a different way, the Islamic, quote, non-state, end quote, of Iran is capitalist and anti-capitalist at the same time. Quote, its position on ownership of the means of production is different in the respect that in the form of an industrialized mode of production, this kind of ownership only exists to a minimal extent. Universal law and contract have disappeared here as well, replaced by the racket's arbitrary course of actions, end quote. Shite. A central difference to National Socialism, however, is its position on labor. The affiliation with the Islamist collective, different from Nazi Germany, has almost nothing to do with labor as a commodity. Quote, in such a collective, even somebody who does not have any prospect for a job can feel useful and not superfluous, even when he does not expect the Ummah to provide him with one. Everything beyond the racket system that threatens and exposes the individual to superfluousness, the individual projects on a total enemy, the Gegenvolk, or, quote, counter nation, end quote. Shite. These projections culminate in a suicidal desire for annihilation that concentrates on the state of Israel, that includes self-sacrifice, and that is virtually invoked by the Iranian Islamist ideology of martyrdom. Traditional anti-Semitism in Iran. In the latter part of the 1930s, the future revolutionary leader Khomeini was a regular listener to the National Socialist shortwave radio station Radio Gießen, which disseminated anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda in the Middle East. This does not mean that Khomeini identified totally with Hitler's ideology, about which he is said sometimes to have made disparaging remarks. Other religious notables, such as Ayatollah Abu al-Qasim Kashani, among whose pupils Khomeini must be reckoned, and who in the 1940s was interned in Iran because of his, quote, pro-fascist, end quote, attitude, however, took an explicitly positive stance towards Nazism. In relation to anti-Semitism, the current Iranian regime is a classic example of the continued impact of Nazism after its military defeat. Khomeini's ideology was not directed solely against the Israeli state, but particularly pre-1979, was open about its antagonism to the Jews. In this respect, the future revolutionary leader could draw on the tradition of 19th century Persian Islamic anti-Semitism. On several occasions, Khomeini attacked his main political target, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as a, quote, Jew, end quote, who took his orders from Israel. The linkage of his fantasies about a, quote, Jewish world state, end quote, that had to be fought, through which he projected his own megalomania onto its prospective Jewish victims, with traditional anti-Jewish attitudes, is a classic example of the fusion of Islamic anti-Judaism and modern anti-Semitism that characterizes Islamic anti-Semitism. The continuing presence of Jewish communities in Iran is often used to call into question the anti-Semitic character of the regime. It is indeed true that at present Jews in Iran are not persecuted to the same extent as other religious minorities such as Baha'i that are not recognized as, quote, religions of the book, end quote. However, this argument overlooks the fact that Iran's Jews do not enjoy equal civil rights. The Jewish minority faces systematic discrimination and is obliged constantly to distance itself from Israel. Even authors who otherwise downplay Khomeini's explicitly anti-Jewish statements as, quote, polemic, end quote, admit that Jews are considered dhimmis, who are subject to many special rules and restrictions and have to accept Islamic domination. Jews, like most of the other, quote, recognized, end quote, minorities, cannot be, for example, ministers, judges, or teachers in regular schools. All the recognized minorities are subject to discriminatory rules, for example, regarding inheritance, giving evidence in court, and in the operation of the, quote, blood money, end quote, system, the financial compensation paid to the family of someone who has been killed or to the victim who has been injured through negligence, which discriminates between Muslims and non-Muslims and between men and women. In the circumstances, it is not surprising that about 90% of the estimated 100 to 150,000 Jews who lived in the country before the Islamic Revolution of 1979 have since departed. Despite the fact that since the revolution, Khamenei, and other leading figures in the regime have publicly stated on several occasions that their policy and ideology is not directed against Jews as long as they distance themselves from Zionism and accept Islamic rule, there have also been explicitly anti-Jewish statements from by no means marginal figures that pay no heed to this rhetorical distinction. It is common to find the terms Jew and Zionist or Jewry and Zionism used interchangeably in Iranian official propaganda. Holocaust denial competitions, conferences, and films. The first international competition for Holocaust cartoons took place in 2005, shortly after Ahmadinejad became president. The competition, in which the, quote, artists, end quote, from 63 countries took part, was organized by the Hamshari Institute, which produces the popular magazine of the same name on behalf of the Tehran city authorities. A selection from the almost 1,200 entries went on public display in August 2006. In December 2006, under the title Review of the Holocaust, Global Vision, the most representative Holocaust denial conference to date took place in Iran, organized by the Institute for Political and International Studies, which is attached to the Iranian Foreign Ministry. It was opened by the Iranian Foreign Minister, Manouchehr Mottaki, and President Ahmadinejad attended the closing ceremony. The event brought together the who's who of the international Holocaust denial scene. Among those present were the former head of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke, Bradley Smith from the Committee for Open Debate on the Holocaust, and German-Australian right-wing extremist Frederick Tubin. George Tile, and Robert Farisson from France, and Herbert Schaller and Wolfgang Froelich from Austria. In the years following this conference, the Iranian official media played a crucial role in the discussions among and networking within the international Holocaust denial movement. In 2012, the Iranian regime stepped up its anti-Semitic agitation when, on April 19th, the Israeli Day of Commemoration of the Shoah, the state broadcaster showed 10 animated films that denied the Holocaust in a form otherwise found only among declared old and neo-Nazis. All the animations were based on the book Holocartoons, illustrated by Maziar Bijani and written by Omid Madinejad, which was presented by the Iranian Minister of Education Ali Reza Ali Ahmadi in 2008 and was in the subsequent years globally disseminated over the internet in several languages. To get an impression of the nauseating character of this explicitly anti-Semitic effort, it is sufficient to describe the opening scene, which appears in all 10 of the films. Quote, "We see a Nazi, recognizable from the swastika on his armband, holding a spray can with, quote, gas, end quote, written on it. He activates it. As soon as the screen is totally obscured by the gas, the hook-nosed worm, giggling loudly and marked as Jewish by a kippah, appears and eagerly sucks in the Nazi gas with relish. Finally, he loudly belches out 2 little clouds of gas that form the word, quote, Holocaust, end quote. End quote. The episodes that follow this introduction are on the same level. Quote, one of the films concerns a strange steel contraption displaying the words, quote, gas chamber, end quote. The same 10 Jews enter from the front and exit from the back of the chamber, while the meter counts the number of through passages, and at the number 6 million rings loudly. Then the Jews fall laughing hysterically into one another's arms, having perfectly simulated the murder of 6 million, although not a single one has died. End quote. Matthias Kunzel notes that these films reveal the global significance of the Iranian regime's Holocaust denial. The use of animation in itself indicates that they are aimed at a global audience. Whatever speech and text there is in English, and indeed these pieces were disseminated worldwide, including on YouTube. In 2014, after Rouhani had become president, the Iranian regime once again provided a platform in Tehran for the international community of conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites, with the, quote, Second New Horizon Conference of Independent Thinkers, end quote. This time, alongside the traditional Holocaust deniers, the bulk of the guests were, quote, 9/11 truthers, end quote. The left liberal Israeli daily, Haaretz, has described the New Horizon Conference as networking meetings for, quote, Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Russian imperialists, Ukrainian fascists, Chinese spies, Gaddafi devotees, Corbyn fans, Assad apologists, neo-Nazis, Trump devotees, French Holocaust deniers, Western anti-war feminists, African-American separatists, Venezuelan socialists, and anti-Semites of every conceivable form and type, end quote. In 2015, the second International Holocaust Cartoons competition took place under the auspices of the Iran House of Cartoon and the Sarchesma Cultural Complex, which participates from over 50 countries. In May 2016, a selection of cartoons went on show at the 11th International Cartoon Biennial and in the Palestine Contemporary Art Museum in Tehran. In the West, Foreign Minister Zarif claimed that such events were organized by bodies without ties to the state. According to Majid Muhammadi, however, there is no doubt about the responsibility of Rouhani's government for the Holocaust cartoon contest and similar events. Quote, the expenses of these activities are totally paid by government institutions, whether military, cultural, municipal, or religious. These institutions, their pseudo-branches and seemingly private affiliates, may have misleading titles, but they are all organized, financed, and managed under the Supreme Guide's office. his appointed bodies, and the executive branch headed by the president, end quote. On leader.ir, Khamenei's official English language website, it has continued to be possible, under Rouhani's presidency, to read about the, quote, myth, end quote, of the Holocaust. Moreover, other prominent figures in the regime have repeatedly spoken in the same vein. Thus, Rafsanjani declared on Iranian state radio that his personal research has led him to the conclusion that Hitler murdered no more than 20,000 Jews. The former president, who until his death in 2017 was chairman of the influential Expediency Council, stated during a visit by the minister-president of Lower Saxony, Stephan Weil, before the Second World War, the Zionists had destabilized Europe with money and media. Germany had wished to take revenge and, quote, send these people to Palestine, end quote, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel. In contrast to his earlier statements, in this case, Rafsanjani was ready to admit to at least the possibility that 6 million Jews might have died in the war. However, according to Rafsanjani, this was nothing in comparison with his delusional claim of 20 million deaths and 8 million refugees after the foundation of Israel. His successor, Khatami, meanwhile, who to this day is often presented as the model of a, quote, reformist Islamist, end quote, became one of the most passionate defenders of the French Holocaust denial. Roger Garaudy, who was, I believe, important member of the French Communist Party up until becoming a Holocaust denier when he, I don't know his exact story. I think he married a Muslim woman and then became a Holocaust denier. Not that those two things necessarily lead to one another, of course, but I think that was his story. So, former Marxist. Maybe he still continues to call himself a Marxist. I don't know, but Roger Garaudy definitely comes from the left. And arranged for him to have an audience with Khamenei. At the end of 2019, Khamenei on Twitter praised Garaudy's, quote, bravery and tirelessness, end quote. In an interview on CNN in 2013, when asked a direct question about the Holocaust, Rouhani answered that he was a politician and not a historian and could not therefore say anything about the, quote, dimensions of historical events, end quote. In May 2019, Mustafa Pourmohammadi, Interior Minister under Ahmadinejad, then Justice Minister in Rouhani's first cabinet, and now an advisor to the head of the Iranian judiciary, aggressively challenged the reality of the, quote, so-called Holocaust, end quote, declaring that, quote, if we are fighting the Jews, Zionism, then we are fighting the contemporary invasive civilization of arrogance, end quote. Majid Mohammadi succinctly summarizes the different approaches to Holocaust denial of the Iranian regime's various factions, which differ not about the basic aims of the Islamic Republic, but how to achieve those aims. Quote, the only difference between the reformist and non-reformist is their tactics. Reformists believe that denying the Holocaust is not a priority, while the non-reformists believe that hatred against Israel and the Jews will increase the Islamic Republic's influence in the region. They believe that exhibitions of Holocaust cartoons help the Islamic Republic to promote its objectives and strategies to be a force in global issues, end quote. Threats to destroy Israel. The purpose of the Iranian regime's Holocaust denial and relativization is, firstly, the retrospective delegitimation of the delegitimation of the foundation of Israel, and secondly, the prospective legitimation of Israel's destruction. In Iran, the relativization and denial of Nazi crimes served the regime's eliminatory anti-Zionism. As regards the conspiracy theorizing and projective worldview, Holocaust denials and relativization, and the Iranian regime's threats to destroy Israel, nothing substantial has changed under Rouhani. In early 2018, during his second term, the Iranian regime issued an invitation to the first Hourglass Festival, whose website, IsraelHourglass.com, attacks the, quote, fake regime, end quote, named Israel. The festival's symbol was a Star of David dissolving through an hourglass. The festival organizer, Hossein Amir Abdollahian, that's my best guess, is an aide to the president of the Iranian pseudo-parliament, Ali Larijani, and general secretary of the International Conference in support of the Palestinian Intifada. He served as a deputy foreign minister under both Ahmadinejad and Rouhani. For several months, submissions were accepted that illustrated the hoped-for end of Israel in the next 25 years and the malicious, quote, bestial, end quote, and, quote, inhuman, end quote, character of Zionism and its supporters. The motto of the festival refers to speeches by Khamenei from 2015 and 2016, in which he proclaimed that the, quote, Zionist regime, end quote, would be wiped out by 2040 at the latest. In 2017, the ruling Ayatollahs had a large digital clock erected in Tehran that is counting down the days until the final victory over the Jewish state. Hezbollah's anti-Semitism. Hezbollah's anti-Semitism. All factions of the regime are also at one when it comes to supporting the anti-Semitic terrorist organizations on Israel's borders. At the beginning of 2019, Foreign Minister Zarif, considered a, quote, moderate, end quote, in Europe, met with Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, in Beirut, to discuss future common action, while in Tehran, Rouhani had a high-profile meeting with Ziad al-Nakhala, the new general secretary of Islamic Jihad. Al-Nakhala has significantly stepped up the Islamic Jihad's cooperation with Tehran in comparison with his predecessor, Ramadan Shallah, so that it has overtaken Hamas as Iran's main ally in Gaza. The alliance with the Lebanese terrorist militia, Hezbollah, has also been maintained under Rouhani, gaining crucial importance in relation to the war in Syria. Moreover, support for the Houthi rebels in Yemen, or Houthi, I'm not sure. Houthi rebels in Yemen has also been increased in recent years. The Houthi rebels have long had close contacts with Hezbollah and the Potsdam, and has drawn ideologically closer to the Iranian regime since 2015. The slogans of Tehran's Yemeni allies leave no doubt as to their ideological priorities. Quote, God is great, end quote. Quote, death to the USA, end quote. Quote, death to Israel, end quote. Quote, curse on the Jews, end quote. End quote, victory to Islam, end quote. In 2015, Qasem Soleimani, whose influence within the Iranian power structure has grown enormously as a consequence of the Pasdaran's involvement in Iraq and Syria, declared that Iran might soon control Jordan in the same way as it now controls Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Until he was killed by the U.S. military in 2020, Soleimani was the commander of the Potsdam's Quds Force, which is responsible for extraterritorial interventions. The name of this force, Al-Quds, is the Arabic for Jerusalem, indicates the goal of all their efforts. At the end of 2018, Mohammad Reza Naqvi, deputy commander of the Potsdam and commander of the Basiji militia, announced that Israel, quote, must be destroyed and wiped out, end quote, and, quote, Zionists must be annihilated, end quote. Major General Hussein Salami, the commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guards, said in September 2019 that destroying Israel has become, quote, an achievable goal, end quote, thanks to the country's technological advances. Quote, this sinister regime must be wiped off the map, end quote. And, quote, this is no longer a dream. We have managed to obtain the capacity to destroy the imposter Zionist regime, end quote. Deeds have matched words so that now Israel faces on its borders not only the Iranian regime's allies, but the regime itself. The incursion by an Iranian drone into Israeli airspace in February 2018 represented a dangerous escalation of the situation, as did the Iranian rocket attacks on the Golan Heights in May 2018. In particular, Hezbollah's massive military buildup in Lebanon and the Iranian presence in Syria present Israel with huge problems. Hezbollah, Tehran's most important and powerful ally in the region, today possesses over 130,000 rockets aimed exclusively at the Jewish state. How seriously the threat from a Hezbollah armed to the teeth by Tehran is taken in Israel can be seen inter alia from the fact that the liberal daily Haaretz has criticized the right-wing Netanyahu government for not intervening to destroy the Lebanese terrorist militia's arsenal. The Lebanese Shiite militia has been involved in many attacks, such as the bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994 that killed 85 people. Its General Secretary, Hassan Nasrallah, echoes Khamenei and Rouhani in calling Israel a, quote, cancerous, tyrannical entity, end quote, and has described Zionist Jews in classically dehumanizing anti-Semitic terms as, quote, the descendants of apes and pigs, end quote. Back in the early 1990s, the movement's long-standing spiritual leader, Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah, declared the, quote, struggle against the Jewish state, end quote, as the, quote, continuation of the struggle of the Muslims against the Jews' conspiracy against Islam, end quote. Nasrallah more or less exalts over the fact that Jews come from all over the world to Israel, where the, quote, axis of resistance, end quote, of Iran and Hezbollah can more easily fight them. Quote, the Jews from the entire world will come to occupied Palestine, but this will not be done for their Antichrist to rule. God Almighty wanted to save you the trouble of finding them all over the world, end quote. In 1997, Nasrallah stated in a speech that, quote, if we search the entire globe for a more cowardly, lowly, weak, and frail individual in his spirit, mind, ideology, and religion, we will never find anyone like the Jew, and I am not saying the Israeli. We have to know the enemy we are fighting, end quote. According to the Hezbollah TV station, Al-Manar, quote, Judaism is a project against all humanity. It's about time the world understands this. Those who are fighting Israel are not just defending themselves. They are defending the whole world. "There is no such thing as Zionism. There is only Judaism," end quote. Nasrallah's deputy, Naim Qassem, has declared, quote, "The history of Jews has proven that, regardless of the Zionists' proposal, they are people who are evil in their ideas," end quote. In the same way as the Iranian regime, Hezbollah denies or relativizes the Holocaust and defends Holocaust deniers such as Roger Gouradi. In 2000, Al-Manar proclaimed that, quote, "The Jews have invented the fairy tale of the Nazi massacre against the Jews," end quote. Just to keep this in mind. Oh, never mind. Sorry. Just to keep this in mind, Hezbollah is a group that Jeremy Corbyn declared as friends, and that Judith Butler declared as part of a global progressive left for peace, or something like something in that vein. Just to be clear about how the left has regarded this organization, at least certain quarters of the left. In 2003, Al-Manar broadcast a 26-part series that, it explained, would show how, quote, "Jews do not shrink from committing the worst crimes in order to realize their Jewish dream," end quote. The whole series, in which Jews are accused of responsibility for both the First and Second World Wars, must be seen as a modernized dramatization and illustration of the anti-Semitic classic, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Remco Leemhuis, director of the American Jewish Committee in Berlin and today one of Germany's leading experts on Hezbollah, has succinctly summed up the central role of anti-Semitism for the Lebanese Shiite militia. It is, quote, "not only a basic reference point in Hezbollah's ideology, it is its core," end quote. An analysis of the movement's anti-Semitic propaganda shows that the conflict with Israel, quote, "again and again serves as the vehicle for the various anti-Semitic lines of argument," end quote. The battle with the Jewish state, quote, "is therefore only a catalyst that provides imagery that constantly serves to revitalize and update anti-Semitic ideologisms," end quote. The necessity of a new policy toward Iran. The Iranian regime is today one of the main promoters of global anti-Semitism. With its ongoing effort to obtain the technology of mass destruction and its pursuit of the related missile program, its regional expansion to the borders of Israel, and the massive arming of its equally anti-Semitic allies such as Hezbollah, it currently presents the main danger to the security of the Jewish state. This is reflected in the official military strategy of the Israeli Defense Forces. It is hard to overestimate the contribution that the fall of the regime of the Ayatollahs and Pastaran would make to the fight against global anti-Semitism and for the defense of Israel. In these circumstances, it is necessary to break a taboo in European discussion of Iran and envisage both a realistic and desirable prospect that, In these circumstances, it is necessary to break a taboo in the European discussion of Iran and envisage, as a both realistic and desirable prospect, that scenario that the German Social Democratic Foreign Minister Heiko Maas can only imagine as a nightmare, a future for Iran beyond the rule of the Ayatollahs and Revolutionary Guards. To help bring this about, the European Union must abandon its cooperation and appeasement policy towards Tehran. The nuclear agreement of 2015, to which the EU still clings, did not lead to the end of the Iranian nuclear and missile programs, but to their institutionalization. The Ayatollah's missile program, which is an essential component of its bid for nuclear weapons capability, was excluded from the agreement. The entire infrastructure of the nuclear program remains intact, while the nuclear facilities have been modified and subjected to conditions. The structures themselves are still there. The permanent and unrestricted monitoring that supporters of the agreement for a long time considered essential has not happened, especially with respect to the military structures that the International Atomic Energy Agency suspects of having been used for testing nuclear warheads. It is, therefore, not surprising that the regime has been found to have broadly adhered to the agreement. With the expiry of the absolutely inadequate restrictions in a few years' time, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action will have paved the way to the bomb instead of blocking it. The deal was a gamble on the future. The agreement's supporters hoped to persuade the Iranian regime to moderate its behavior. Developments over the past few years, however, have been in the opposite direction. The regime has been encouraged by the deal to pursue an extremely aggressive foreign policy, financed by the billions that have flowed in as a result of the deal itself. The 700 rockets that were fired at Israel from Gaza in May 2019, the 700 rockets that were fired at Israel from Gaza in May 2019 once again showed that cooperation with the Iranian regime has not brought about the stability the European Union hoped for, but fostered war and terror. When Iranian-backed terrorist groups attack Israel, more than merely verbal solidarity is required from Europe. If the commitment to Israel's security is to be more than empty words, then the European countries, and above all Germany, as the successor state to National Socialism, must immediately impose stringent sanctions on the Holocaust denier regime in Tehran that facilitates the attacks of both Hamas and Islamic Jihad on the state of the Shoah's survivors. However, to this end, the European Union must also free itself from the blackmail to which it exposed itself as a result of the negotiations over the Iranian nuclear program. The idea of moderating the regime through integrating it into international trade has proved totally illusory. A 180-degree turn in German and European policy toward Iran is urgently needed. There must be no more support for the anti-Semitic regime and full support for the democratic and secular opposition in Iran and in exile. Little description of Stephan Grigat. I'll read it, why not? Stephan Grigat is lecturer of political science at the University of Vienna and at the University of Passau, permanent fellow of the Moses Mendelssohn Center for European Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam, research fellow at the Herzl Institute for the Study of Zionism at the University of Haifa, and academic director of the NGO Stop the Bomb for a nuclear-free and democratic Iran. He is visiting professor at the University of Gießen and Moses Mendelssohn Center and visiting lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.